Welcome to my channel today. Top stories. Netanyahu won't commit to abiding by ruling if Supreme Court blocks controversial law. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has refused to say if he would abide by any potential Supreme Court ruling striking down his controversial judicial reform law, as Israelis agonize over a looming showdown between their government and the court. In an interview with CNN's Wolf Blitzer, Netanyahu warned that the country could enter uncharted territory if the Supreme Court overturned a law which strips the court of its power to block government actions. What you're talking about is a situation, or potential situation, where in American terms, the United States Supreme Court would take a constitutional amendment and say that it's unconstitutional, Netanyahu said. That's the kind of spiral that you're talking about, and I hope we don't get to that. The so-called reasonableness law is an amendment to one of Israel's basic laws, which exist in place of a formal constitution. It passed the Knesset on Monday despite 6 months of protests and rare public criticism from the White House. It is the first stage in a wider package of measures that critics say will undermine democracy in Israel by weakening the judiciary's ability to hold politicians in check. The Supreme Court has said that it will hear appeals against the law in September. Benny Gantz, the leader of Israel's opposition National Unity Party, warned that if Netanyahu ignored an adverse ruling from the country's top court, it would amount to a coup. In a democratic country, a prime minister respects and acts according to court rulings, no matter how much he disagrees with them, Gantz said on Twitter. There is no room for interpretation and gray areas, clear and smooth. If Netanyahu, like any elected official, does not follow the court's ruling, he will carry out a regime coup d'état that will change the nature of the regime in Israel, something that will negate his legitimacy to hold office. Netanyahu's office issued a statement in an attempt to clarify his position on Friday, but cautioned there was no precedent for the Supreme Court blocking a basic law. Israeli governments always respect the court's decisions, and the court has always considered itself subject to basic laws to which it attributes the status of a constitution, the statement read. Like the majority of Israeli citizens, Prime Minister Netanyahu believes that it is necessary to continue to maintain these two principles together. The statement accused the opposition of distorting his words. U.S. President Joe Biden has been unusually outspoken about the judicial overhaul proposal, suggesting it amounts to an erosion of democratic institutions and could undermine U.S.-Israel relations. Asked if he was expecting consequences from the United States for the bill's passing, Netanyahu stressed that relations remain strong between the Biden White House and his government, the most far-right and religious in Israel's history. Netanyahu also pointed to debate in the U.S. over its own Supreme Court. You have an internal debate in the United States right now, about the powers of the Supreme Court, about whether it's abusing its power, whether you should curtail it, he said. Does that make the American democracy not a democracy? Does that make that debate unworthy? Does that make that issue a symbol of the fact that you're moving to some dictatorship personally? He said. Israel's new law strips the Supreme Court of the ability to reject some government decisions on the basis of the reasonableness standard. It was the first of the government's major judicial reforms to be passed by the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Critics have also accused Netanyahu of pushing the overhaul forward to protect himself from his own corruption trial, where he faces charges of fraud, bribery and breach of trust, which he has denied. Would the new law be used to fire the Attorney General, currently overseeing the trial? I can tell you that this is not going to happen because it needs the heads of all the coalition to agree to it, and they're not going to agree to it. It's not happening, he predicted. Thousands of Israeli army reservists, the backbone of the Israeli military, are threatening not to show up for work over the new legislation, but Netanyahu appeared unfazed by the threat. Yes, there is a big debate, and some of the former generals are leading an effort against this reform. That's okay. It's a legitimate thing, he said. But in a democracy, the day that former generals can force democratically elected officials to stop legislation on this or that matter, I would say that's the day that Israel really stopped being a democracy, he said. That said, he does not want to minimize the concerns that people have because many of them have been caught in this spiral of fear, he added. Israel is going to remain a democracy. There are checks and balances. EU stops financial and security support to Niger as pressure mounts following coup. The European Union suspended all security cooperation and will no longer provide financial support to Niger following the coup in the West African country, the bloc's top diplomat said. Abdurrahmane Tiani, a general who leads the country's presidential guard, was declared the country's new leader after President Mohamed Bazoum was detained earlier this week. This unacceptable attack on the integrity of Niger's republican institutions will not remain without consequences for the partnership and cooperation between the European Union and Niger, in all its various aspects, said Josep Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief. President Bazoum was democratically elected. He is and remains the only legitimate president of Niger. He must be released unconditionally and without delay. Though much of the international has condemned the Nigerian military for ousting the country's democratically elected leader, President Bazoum, on Thursday, the EU's move appears to be one of the first concrete steps punishing the putschists for their move. Leaders from Washington to Moscow have called for Bazoum's release, so far to no avail. The African Union on Saturday demanded that Nigerian military personnel immediately and unconditionally return to their barracks and restore constitutional authority within 15 days. The OAU warned it would take necessary action, including punitive measures against the perpetrators, should the rights of political detainees not be respected. Borrell and French President Emmanuel Macron both said they would be willing to support regional organizations, including the Economic Community of West African States, should they decide to bring sanctions against Niger. It is unclear to what extent international pressure would impact the decision of those attempting to seize power. An aide loyal to the deposed president told CNN there was infighting among the plotters. However, Niger's military have endorsed the coup. Niger lies at the heart of Africa's Sahel region, which has seen numerous power grabs in recent years, including in Mali and Burkina Faso. A key ally of the United States, France and other Western governments, Niger had been one of the few democracies in a region fraught with Islamist insurgencies.